Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Music is Not a Genre's PODFAST. Oh, man. Okay, yeah, no. I knew that was going to happen. That was not a surprise because this is a very competitive episode, and you'll see why in a second. So I appreciate PODFAST for illustrating that for me. Excellent, but please don't do that again because it kind of hurt. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre to see a video for every single episode of this series. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre and you can find just the audio version of this on pretty much any podcast streaming service. A couple more announcements. Of course, we're still doing a fundraiser for season 7, so please click one of the links above there. Either join me on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre or contribute to the GoFundMe. I'm hoping to add additional resources and personnel for season 7, so it would be awesome to have you support that. Your support is what makes this possible. So everybody says, and it's true. And the other special announcement is in a couple of weeks, I will be announcing a date on which I will be recording a live episode. It will be the next catch-up episode for this and not the condiment, but we're catching up with your comments, fan comments. It's the perfect live episode to do because then anyone who joins in can comment live and we can have a conversation, and that's kind of what I'm looking to do there. So keep tuned. I'm even going to just create a special announcement mini episode to make sure everybody's aware of this, and I'll give you all the details when that happens. So let's get right to it now, or to it after that introduction. This is PODFAST number 21, and the topic is Top 10 Albums Face-Off. PODFAST, stay where you are. You already did it, all right? You do not need to do that again. That really was like a gut punch. And why am I doing this? So I've done top 10 things, top 20, whatever, and I've always been fascinated with lists, partly because I love ranking and I love other people ranking, partly because it starts a debate and a conversation because you just disagree about things you agree about. You get excited when people agree with your favorites or whatever, and partly because it's all kind of artificial and arbitrary, and even though we try to be subjective, there's a lot of, or objective, there's a lot of subjectivity to it. But the main reason I did this is because while I was researching albums of the 1990s, which if you've been following along, just did 2 episodes on that, I stumbled on the fact that Rolling Stone released another top 500 albums list last year in 2023. Now, I read the one 2020, and it actually prompted me to create a topic, which I never got to, and I'm going to kind of touch on today, but I had no idea that they did a revised version in 2023, which is fine. That wouldn't have made a difference, except then I got an email saying that Apple just did their top, I think, 100 albums of all time. So, no, we're not going to go through all 500 or 100 because this is a PODFAST, and even in a normal episode, that's way too long. But we are going to go to the top 10 of each. And I'm going to assess each one, pros and cons and all of that, and then offer up my own list at the end of sorts, among other things. So when I research a band, this is one of the reasons why I love lists like this, and also, never agree with them. I'm always struck by how I usually agree with kind of most of the list, at least as, let's say, if you take the top 10, let's say grade, ranking the albums of Red Hot Chili Peppers or somebody like that, and they have more than 10 albums and all of that, and you take the top 10, I generally agree that those albums should belong in the top 10, but I generally disagree often with which one should be first, which one should be fourth, and all of that. And what I usually find is that most lists online do the same number one for everything. And so I'm always excited when I find somebody's list where they chose a different number one. I mean, especially if it's my number one, but even if it's just a different one, because there's sort of conventional wisdom about everything. It would be as if to say, for a while, and it's not true anymore, the best Beatles, album ever is Sgt. Pepper's or whatever, or Abbey Road, or whichever one you pick. And then all of a sudden, everybody has to say that. Even critics who are very good at assessing things will just lean towards that, and that's the end. And it's kind of an expedient. So one reason I like pitting these two top 10 lists against each other is that there are different number ones. There are different, it's a different list, even though they have some crossover, which is kind of cool. So I always say my top 10 is more like 20 rotating artists, maybe even 30. So that's why I'm going at the end. And when I draw my conclusions and everything, I'm also going to give you around 30 of my favorite albums of all time, but I'm not going to rank them. I'm going to let you do that, or you throw in your own. But to give you an idea of what would rise to the top of my list, which of course will be quite different from these lists here. The sources for this episode are the two outlets' top 10 lists, the Rolling Stone top 10 and Apple top 10. And I also checked Wikipedia for some facts and figures and things like that I wanted to throw in when I'm talking about each of these albums. So let's get to the first one. Came out first, and it's the big mama of music publications, Rolling Stone. The top 10 from 2023 I found overall was a pretty diverse set, which is something they've been striving more for in the last 2 or 3 of these. Though, as usual, it favors the 1970s and 1960s and kind of rock a bit more. But I will say it's more diverse than they're used to doing, which is kind of cool. Starting with number 10, Lauryn Hill, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill from 1998. Absolutely good to see this on this list. I think this is the height of the neo-soul movement in the late 90s. It seamlessly blends 90s hip-hop with 70s sounds and instrumentation. It was her baby, Lauryn Hill's baby, through and through. I mean, it was just her brainchild, and the people she brought together, absolutely amazing collaborators, and it's an album that has stood the test of time, and we'll get to more of that a little bit later on. Number 9 for Rolling Stone is Dylan's Blood on the Tracks from 1975. If you're going to pick a Dylan album, I can understand why this one. I don't know his catalog well enough to assess which one might be my favorite. And again, it's usually different from everybody else's favorite, but this is almost always the one that is mentioned as the greatest Dylan album. It's kind of the quintessential heartbreak breakup album, and you get why it's on here. I agree that Dylan should be on this list somewhere. Number 8 is Purple Rain, 1984. Yes, of course, Prince is one of my favorite artists, so this totally makes sense. My favorite Prince album might be different from Purple Rain, but it's still good to see this here, and it's a clear pick, because if you're going to pick anything from Prince, you're going to pick the one that everybody knows. This ranks in 84. He was the first artist ever in history to have the number 1 song, number 1 album, and number 1 movie all at the same time. And personal note, when I heard When Doves Cry and didn't hear a bass line and heard how it was produced, it inspired a lot of what I do, at least one strain. Number 7, Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, spelled the British way, 1977. The ultimate kind of band relationship turmoil album. And I would agree that it is their height, but I don't know that I would put this in the top 10. Should it be in the top 100 or 500? Yeah, absolutely. I totally get why it would be. I don't know why this would end up, though, in the top 10 greatest albums of all time. This, to me, would be like putting the Eagles in the top 10, which, they have their fans, and I know their fans. I've never been a huge fan. I don't know what else to say about that. Other than I'm glad the Eagles aren't in the top 10. But again, if they probably deserve, Hotel California or whatever it is deserves to be in the top 500 or something like that. But I don't think Fleetwood Mac deserves to be in the top 10. That said, there are some absolute classics on this album, like Go Your Own Way, Dreams, Don't Stop Believing, and The Chain. And it shows that a band could have several composers and singers and still be a band, which Chicago did and some other band, the Beatles did. So that's not the easiest thing to do. So, I just happen to think this is a kind of a very old white dude pick. And respect the album, respect the band. Don't think it should be in the top 10. Never mind, Nirvana 1991 is number 6. It makes sense to me that of any Nirvana album or any grunge album for that matter, it would be this one that would be in the top 10, because it's kind of the talisman for all grunge. It was the one that kind of broke grunge nationally, and it knocked Michael Jackson off the chart or off the number 1 or whatever it is. And I might be biased Even though at the time I loved Pearl Jam more than Nirvana, I'm now, there's no contest between the two at all. And yeah, this might be in a way as much of an old white dude pick as Fleetwood Mac is in its own way, but you can't deny it's seminal. You can't deny it changed the, face of music for years to come, if not forever. And like all picks on this list, has no weak tracks. And let's not forget how pop it was too. It was something that Cobain was saying before he died, how he wanted to veer more into the pop aesthetic of the things he had done. And it didn't mean that he didn't do pop. He did grunge with hooks. So it was a version of power pop, if you will. Number 5 on this Rolling Stone list is Abbey Road, 1969. Beatles, again, valid choice. Pretty pat choice. It's the one everyone goes to when they say, what's the greatest Beatles album? Totally get it. I would obviously put that in the top 3 greatest. I would put Revolver over Abbey Road. And let me qualify that by saying when I was a child, Sgt. Pepper was my favorite. After that, it was Abbey Road. And then for years, it was White Album, which no one would put at the top of the Beatles list, but I absolutely love that album for so many reasons. And it still is kind of my heart favorite in many ways, all the stylistic changes and all of that, the range. But if I had to say one, and I did this in my Beatles series, so look that up on youtube.com/@musicsnotagenre. There's a whole playlist of my Beatles themed episodes. I did say I think Revolver is their best album. So while I fully agree that the Beatles should be in the top 5, I don't fully agree that Abbey Road should be the one. Number 4, Songs in the Key of Life, 1976, Stevie Wonder. Yes, also yes, and also hell yes. Stevie needs to be on this list, and he needs to be in the top 5. And honestly, why not a double album of greatness, But I will say this, if you consider where I'm coming from was him dipping his toe into breaking out of the Motown mold. Music of My Mind and Talking Book were fleshing that out with increasingly great results. I personally consider Inner Visions the peak, and would actually put Inner Visions at the top of my list of Stevie Wonder albums. But listen, you get Inner Visions, you've got Fulfilling This' first finale, and then you've got Songs in the Key of Life. Pick any one of those 3. They're all freaking incredible, and it was just a run unlike any other artist probably in history. And what's interesting is after Songs in the Key of Life, setting aside the, Journey Through the Secret Life of Plants or whatever it was called, he wouldn't make another proper album until Hotter Than July in 1980. And at that point, he kind of mostly left behind that classic sound. Which brings me to number 3, Joni Mitchell's Blue in 1971. I mean, she's in the news right now. She's very hot, and deservedly so. And I'm glad that she's out there singing again and kind of making the rounds and all of that. And she absolutely 100% deserves to be on this list. I would put it in the top 20 for sure. I think as 3, I think it's this. And I'm going to say this for this one. I'm going to say this for Rolling Stone's number 1 pick. Absolutely deserving artists. Absolutely deserving albums. But I feel like they are trying to make a point with some of these picks, and not just with the picks, because I think, again, the picks are super valid, but with the ranking of certain picks by saying, see, we're not just a magazine that's been around for 50 some years, almost 60 years at this point. We have evolved too, and we understand that more women and people of color need to be recognized for their achievements. And I completely agree with that. This should be on the list. I don't know that I would put it as high as number 3, but my wife's a huge fan of Joni Mitchell, so many singer-songwriters, and this is a masterclass in singer-songwriting and singer-songwriter-ism, and that certain kind of sound that we associate with singer-songwriters, although that's not the whole world of singer-songwriters. And so many artists have been influenced by Joni Mitchell. So honestly, who am I to say that this shouldn't be at number 3? That's just my opinion. Number 2, Pet Sounds, Beach Boys, 1966. Okay, Beach Boys, Brian Wilson, genius, absolute production masterclass. But there is no possible way that this should be above Stevie Wonder and the Beatles. I get that it is a classic. I get that it's a masterpiece. I get that it is influential hugely but put it at 8 or 10. Now, number 2 is, this is what I think there is a kind of contrarian aesthetic to a lot of critics and a lot of people who shy away from, oh my God, we keep hearing about the Beatles and the Beatles are the greatest band ever and they're the standard by which everything else is measured. So screw that. I'm going to say that the Beach Boys album was better than any of the Beatles albums. And that's to me, that's a contrarian move. Again, deserves to be on the list, deserves to be in the top 10, I would say, but above the Beatles, above Stevie Wonder? No, I don't think so. Although I got to say, okay, most of the songs are great. Most, maybe all, I don't know. It's an incredible album. I don't think songwriting wise, it measures up to most of, honestly, what the Beatles did, or at least later in their career. And I don't think it measures up to what Stevie or Dylan did as much. But again, it's nitpicking. Because I think it does deserve to be in somewhere in the top 10 or 15, but not number 2. Which brings me to number 1. It's the same number 1 as their 2020 list, and it's Marvin Gaye's What's Going On from 1971. This may sound controversial, but I think this is a token choice. Do I think it deserves to be on the list as Marvin Gaye should be? Yes, 100% absolutely. And you understand the cultural significance of this album, and you understand how it changed the landscape of what artists could do and really helped to mold the 70s. But this is really, I don't think this should be above Stevie Wonder. I think this is on a par with Curtis Mayfield, to be honest, which was also incredible. But it's maybe a lot like, stay with me, Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey. When I first saw that, all I could hear about was that it was a masterpiece and great. And it started off this whole trend of sci-fi movies, and it had certain tropes in there that everybody used. And yes, is first, the thing that 2020 list compelled me to write an episode on that I never did is first best always best? So someone comes out of the gate first and does something no one else did. Does that make it the best? My answer is not always. And in this case, I think it's a hard call. I would say some of Stevie's albums are better than this album, and that they needed to make a point. We need to put something like this at number 1 again to show that we understand that times have changed and this kind of thing needs to be respected and revered. I get it. And I understand how hard it is for anybody to break the ice. I've got another episode coming up in a couple of weeks about that in sort of a way, and led the way for other artists to do this. But Apple put it at number 17. I kind of think it's a better fit for this, which top 20 deserving of albums of all time ever. Yes, absolutely. But number 1, yeah, I think it's a push. I think it's kind of like, well, we need to put something up there, and that's got to be the one. And that's my take on Rolling Stone's top 10, which brings me to the other side of this face-off. Don't do anything PodFast. Stay where you are. Apple's top 10 list, which is more diverse than Rolling Stone's by a little. It's a bit pretentious, as a lot of the more contemporary, you think about Spin or Pitchfork or things like that. There are a lot of times where the picks are deliberately offbeat in a way that is kind of pretentious. But it's a much better spread of decades and styles. It doesn't rely as heavily on the 1970s, which, again, if you've gone through my album series, which I just did 2 episodes in the 90s, which means I've done the 80s and the 70s and the 60s and 50s and beyond that, you know that I understand that the 70s was a heyday for albums. I would argue that the 90s was probably an even better heyday. So it's good to see that there aren't as many 70s albums on this, although, right, there's so many great 70s albums. Number 10, Beyonce's Lemonade 2016, 100% that she needs more recognition everywhere, including on lists like this and including at the freaking Grammys. But I personally would put Renaissance and maybe even Sasha Fierce above Lemonade. I get that. I understand why Lemonade is the pick, because it's sort of like Abbey Road for the Beatles. If you're going to pick one, or Blood on the Tracks for Dylan, go for Lemonade. And it is a great album. But there are lists I've seen online that rank Renaissance as a higher album than Lemonade. Again, nitpicking, but that's kind of it. This is the one that gets the most attention from Beyonce for so many reasons. It's kind of like Kendrick Lamar's Damn, and keep that in mind. Number 9, Nirvana, Nevermind, 1991. Feels like a better slot for this than number 6. Top 10, great, but 6 might be a little high. It does make me start to wonder, though, why Nirvana gets all the love and Pearl Jam and all the other bands get so much less of it. And I get that. And again, I think it's because it's a talisman. But I think there were albums made by other grunge artists that were even more, I guess, better in some ways than Nevermind was. Of course, I do love that album. Number 8, Amy Winehouse, Back to Black, 2006. It's great that they chose something from the 2000s. I personally wouldn't go any further towards the future than that in lists like this. But I also think it's kind of a pretentious pick to say, yeah, we're hip. We know Amy Winehouse, whatever. She is absolutely worthy of being on a list like this. I would say she belongs somewhere in the top 40 or 50. I don't think it should be in the top 10. I think that it is amazing what Mark Ronson did, one of my favorite producers. Yes, her voice, incredible. The way it all came together, incredible. She influenced so many people like Adele and Lorde and all these, vocalists who were kind of in some ways watered down versions of what Amy Winehouse did. And so you can tell how much I respect her. But I think this is more of a pick of a promise of an unseen future genius than actual genius. It would be as if you put Jeff Buckley in the top 10, promise of future genius, never was able to get there. Deserves to be on the list, but I don't think top 10. Number 7, Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, Mad City, 2012. Maybe that's as far as I would go, and I'll explain that later. 100%. It's my favorite album of his, over To Pimp a Butterfly, over Damn, and the Pulitzer. Great albums. But when I heard Good Kid, Mad City, I was like, I am fully in love. Absolutely fully in love. In fact, this is, I think, the pick on both lists that I'm happiest about. Not because it's my favorite out of all 15 albums represented on these two lists, but because it is the most surprising pick and surprisingly right pick. And I can't say much more about that. Songs in the Key of Life. Again, Stevie Wonder, number 6, 1976. Same as what I said above, and I will say that Rolling Stone's higher slot makes more sense than number 6 here, although it's close enough. And despite Prince ranking higher for me personally than Stevie Wonder, I don't know that Prince should be higher than Stevie Wonder on a list like this. Though honestly, it's probably negligible. All right, number 5, Frank Ocean's Blonde from 2016. I listened to it, and maybe top 100. I don't think top 10. I think this is, again, it's kind of a pretentious pick, and I understand that artistically and sociopolitically, it's a real statement and testament, and it probably did influence a lot of people, but I don't think that it belongs in the top 10 or 50. Maybe top 100. I feel like he's one of those artists who will either grow into a true legend as he develops or kind of be relegated to like a Jill Scott status, revered, but largely forgotten by most music fans. I think also for any best of lists that span history, nothing this recent should be on it because we just haven't figured out how it fits into the landscape of all of music. It's a little, I wouldn't go any less than a decade. Number 4, Prince Purple Rain, 1984. Again, 1,000%. I love that he's in the top 5, or maybe switch it with the Stevie Wonder. But yeah, I love that he's in the top 5. Again, number 3, Abbey Road, 1969. Beatles definitely deserve top 3, and honestly, in my book, should still be number 1. But again, I would put Revolver over Abbey Road. Number 2, Thriller, 1982, Michael Jackson. Yes, for sure. Correcting Rolling Stone's top 10 oversight. Michael Jackson needs to be in there somewhere. I don't think he should be above Prince or the Beatles. I'd put this around 8 and bump out Amy Winehouse and find another absolutely worthy female artist to put in there. Maybe like a Fiona Apple or Alanis Morissette, which I know are on the list, but I think I would rank them higher than Amy. But yeah, I think Michael Jackson, number 2. is pushing it just a little, but only just a little. Because I don't understand how this isn't higher on Rolling Stone's list. There's no doubt it's an incredible album, as was Off the Wall. Which brings me to number 1 from Apple's list, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, 1998. Hell yeah. I might question whether this is the actual number 1 greatest album of all time, but I absolutely think it deserves top 10 status and maybe even top 5 status. It's been influential. It's still fresh. It's still unaged, as the critics said. And it's a sad she hasn't done much since, but with a legacy like this, she can do whatever the hell she wants. I think that's a bold pick. That's a little less tokeny than the Marvin Gaye pick, and yet both are deserving in their own right. Conclusions? Honestly, part of it, as you've heard me say, is do you agree with the pick of a particular artist? Again, saying, is that their best album? Do you think Blood on the Tracks is Dylan's best album? Would you replace it? Would you replace Abbey Road with Revolver or whatever else? That's very personal. So a lot of this is somewhat arbitrary. So much of it becomes contextual in that this was released at such a time under such personal and social circumstances when X was also going on or not going on in the music world and in the world at large. And while I know we can't be truly objective, we need to find better ways to cut out all those considerations and judge the music 100% on its own merits, which none of these lists do. And I know I don't do it in a lot of ways because it's personal, so I don't make these lists. Out of time and context is how these should be judged as much as humanly possible. Part of this is what's considered popular or influential now is chosen over others, and you can't really get away from that. That's just, we live in this moment, so that's why we're choosing certain things. I do agree that most best albums should be from the mid-1960s up until say 10 years ago, because prior to that, most people weren't considering the album as a work of art. And yes, as I've said in my series, the 70s were a heyday, but the 90s deserve more consideration in the top 10, as they have gotten in the top 500 for Rolling Stone. It's good to see some representation of the 2000s and the early 2010s, but you go any close to that, I don't think we really know what will rise from recent history, Frank Ocean being a perfect example. The winner for me, this face-off, Apple's list. Why? More diverse, more spread of decades. Prince and the Beatles are higher, and it's a better number 1 choice. That is how I rule. Okay, my top whatever. I'm going to go quick because I'm running out of time. I'm going to name 28 albums in kind of alphabetical order. You can pick if any of these are your number 1. Beastie Boys, Ill Communication, Beatles, Revolver, Block Party, Silent Alarm, Chicago 5, The Cure, Head on the Door, Foo Fighters' eponymous album, Fountains of Wayne, Welcome Interstate Managers, Green Day, American Idiot, Hole Live Through This, Billy Joel, Glass Houses, Kendrick Lamar, Good Kid, Mad City, Kravitz 5, Nirvana, take your pick, I think In Utero, Pearl Jam 10, Prince, Parade, Red Hot Chili Peppers, By the Way, The Roots, Things Fall Apart, Run DMC's first album, The Smiths, Louder Than Bombs, Matthew Sweet, 100% Fun, Stone Temple Pilots, Tiny Music, The Vatican Thingy, They Might Be Giants, Flood, U2, Unforgettable Fire, Violent Femme's first album, The Who, Who's Next, The Wombats, This Modern Glitch, Yes album, Edge is out, Fragile by just a little bit, and then Rec's Kite to Camden, which is coming out in the fall, so I believe is number 28 and greatest albums of all time picked for me, which leads to the featured album. That's actually not the album that's featured because it's not done yet. And since this is about albums and not singles, I am not going to feature a single. I'm featuring a whole album. And there's not a whole album's worth of material at the end of this episode, don't worry. It's Parts and Labor, Rec's seminal debut album, a statement of purpose, a great place to start to get into my band Rec's music. And it's also the only one old enough to qualify under my rules of no sooner than 10 years. There's an EP there too that might qualify, but nah. And it also holds the current most popular Rec songs on streaming, Gold, which has gotten 1 million or something, and iHeartRadio and a bunch of those, and my cover of Aqua Teen Hunger Force theme, which is the most popular streaming on freaking TikTok and Spotify and so many other places. And I've shared a song from this album, every single song except for one, which I eventually will, because, you know, I like to share a different song each time and not repeat myself. Questions for you. Which top 10 list do you favor? Do you agree with either one? What would be your top 10 albums ever? What would be your number 1? I want to hear all these from you because, as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for watching and listening. PODFAST is so tired from the beginning of this that I don't think it's going to make a showing. I will talk to you next week.